The snow falls softly over Red Square on the last day of the 20th century. It is December 31st, 1999, and Moscow stands on the edge of something unprecedented. The temperature hovers around -10 degrees Celsius. Inside the Kremlin's ancient walls, history is being written in real time. At precisely noon, Russian President Boris Yeltsin sits before television cameras for the last time as leader of the world's largest country. His face shows the wear of 8 turbulent years. His hands tremble slightly, not from nerves, but from the toll of leading a nation through its most chaotic transformation since the revolution. Behind him, the double-headed eagle of Russia watches from the wall. "Dear friends," he begins, his voice heavy with emotion. "Dear fellow citizens, today I am addressing you for the last time as Russian president." Across Russia, 140 million people pause whatever they are doing. Some are preparing for New Year's celebrations. Others are simply trying to survive another winter in a country that has been falling apart for nearly a decade. The Soviet Union, their homeland, their identity, their certainty, collapsed just 8 years ago. Since then, Russia has been adrift. Today, on this extraordinarily important day for me, Yeltsin continues, I want to say a bit more than is usual on such occasions. I want to ask your forgiveness for the fact that many of the dreams we shared did not come true. For the fact that what seemed simple to us turned out to be tormentingly difficult. I ask forgiveness for not justifying some hopes of those people who believed that at one stroke, in one spurt, we could leap from the grey, stagnant, totalitarian past into a light, rich, civilized future. I myself believed in this. It seemed that at one stroke we could overcome everything. But Yeltsin's most shocking announcement is yet to come. I have made a decision, he says. I thought long and painfully about this. Today, on the last day of the outgoing century, I am retiring. The words hang in the cold air, like his visible breath would if he were standing outside. Retiring, effective immediately. And in his place, as acting president of Russia, he names a man most Russians barely know, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. Who is this man? Just 16 months ago, he was virtually unknown outside intelligence circles. A former KGB officer who had been working in relative obscurity in St. Petersburg's city government. No national profile, no charisma that anyone had noticed, no obvious ambition for supreme power. Yet here he is, about to become the acting president of the largest country on earth. How did this happen? How did Vladimir Putin rise from complete obscurity to absolute power in less than 2 years? And perhaps even more remarkably, how has he held on to that power for more than 2 decades in a political system that was supposed to be democratic? This is a story that spans more than half a century. It begins in the rubble of Leningrad after World War II, in the shadow of Stalin's terror. It winds through the corridors of the KGB during the Cold War's final act. It passes through the chaos and near collapse of Russia in the 1990s. And it arrives at the present moment, where one man has reshaped an entire nation in his image. It is a story of calculated patience and ruthless timing, of understanding power in ways that few modern politicians do, of building a system so personalized, so centered on one individual, that it has outlasted all predictions of its demise. It is a story about how an authoritarian leader can emerge from the wreckage of a failed democracy, and how that leader can make himself nearly impossible to remove. To understand how Vladimir Putin came to power, and how he has held on to it for so long, we must journey back to where it all began. not to December 31st, 1999, but to October 7th, 1952, when a baby boy was born in a communal apartment in Leningrad. His parents named him Vladimir, a name that means ruler of the world or renowned prince. Perhaps it was prophetic. Perhaps it was simply a common Russian name. But the child who would bear that name would grow up to fulfill its meaning in ways his parents could never have imagined. The story we are about to tell is one of the most consequential political narratives of our time. It is a story still being written, with chapters yet unfinished. But the arc is clear enough now to trace. From the KGB to the Kremlin. From anonymity to autocracy. From the dying Soviet Union to whatever Russia is becoming under his extended rule. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself in that Kremlin office on December 31st, 1999. Yeltsin has just resigned. You are watching Vladimir Putin step forward to address the nation for the first time as its leader. He is 47 years old. His face is composed, giving away nothing. When he speaks, his voice is calm and measured. "I promise you," he says, "that never, not for 1 second, will there be any pause or break in our work." He keeps that promise. There will be no pause, no break. The work will continue for more than 2 decades and counting. The question is, what work exactly? What has he been building all these years? To answer that, we must go back to the beginning. Context: the Russia that made Putin. To understand Putin, we must first understand the Russia that shaped him. And to understand that Russia, we must begin with a city that has had 3 different names in living memory: St. Petersburg, Petrograd, Leningrad, and now St. Petersburg again. This city on the edge of the Baltic Sea has always been Russia's window to the West, built by Peter the Great in 1703 to drag his backward empire into European modernity. It is a city of palaces and poverty, of culture and cruelty, of imperial grandeur built on the bones of serfs who died constructing it. When Vladimir Putin was born in 1952, the city bore Lenin's name. It had survived the most horrific siege in modern history just a decade earlier. From September 1941 to January 1944, Nazi forces surrounded Leningrad, attempting to starve its people into submission. Over 800,000 civilians died, from hunger, from cold, from the artillery bombardments that never seemed to cease. Putin's mother, Maria, barely survived that siege. She tells the story of lying among bodies being collected for mass burial, so weakened by starvation that the collectors thought she was dead. Only a last-moment sign of life saved her. Putin's father, Vladimir Sr., fought on the Leningrad front, sustaining serious wounds. These were not unusual stories. Every family in Leningrad had them. But they formed the foundational myth of Soviet identity, the great patriotic war, the suffering, the ultimate triumph over fascism. The Putin family lived in a communal apartment on Baskov Lane in central Leningrad. Imagine what this means. A single apartment designed for one family now houses 4 or 5 families, each crammed into a single room. They share one kitchen, one bathroom, one telephone in the hallway. There is no privacy. Every argument can be heard. Every meal's smell permeates the space. Every coming and going is noted by neighbors who are simultaneously companions and informants. This was normal life for millions of Soviet citizens. Vladimir Putin grew up in 20 square meters of space, sharing a landing with families whose lives were intimately entangled with his own. The communal apartment was a microcosm of Soviet society itself, collective living enforced by scarcity, with all the tensions and accommodations that entailed. As a child, Putin was small for his age, thin and scrappy. The courtyard of his building was rough territory, rat-infested, literally. He tells a story from his childhood about cornering a rat in the stairwell. The rat, with nowhere to go, turned and attacked him. He fled. The lesson, he would later reflect, was about desperation and cornered adversaries. It is a story he returns to when explaining his worldview. The Soviet Union of Putin's childhood was entering what would later be called its period of stagnation. Stalin had died in 1953, when Putin was less than a year old. Nikita Khrushchev's brief thaw, a period of relative liberalization, gave way to Leonid Brezhnev's long, ossifying rule. The economy ran on inertia and oil revenues. The political system was sclerotic. The empire was vast but brittle. Yet for all its problems, the Soviet system provided something: certainty. Everyone had a job, however meaningless. Everyone had a place to live, however cramped. Everyone knew the rules, even if the rules were oppressive. There was a social contract, however warped. The state provided basic security, and in return, citizens surrendered freedom, creativity, and truth itself. Putin grew up entirely within this system. He never knew pre-revolutionary Russia. He never experienced the relative freedom of the 1920s before Stalin's terror. He came of age in the Brezhnev era, when the revolutionary fervor had long since calcified into bureaucratic authoritarianism, and the Soviet project had devolved into maintaining the appearance of success while the substance crumbled. Like virtually all Soviet children, Putin joined the Young Pioneers, the communist youth organization. He wore the red neckerchief. He learned the songs and slogans. He absorbed the mythology. The Soviet Union as the vanguard of human progress, surrounded by enemies, destined for eventual triumph. Individual desires must be subordinated to the collective good. Vigilance was necessary. The West was hostile. Mother Russia must be defended. These ideas soaked into young minds like water into soil. They would grow there, adapting and changing as circumstances shifted, but never entirely leaving. Putin was not an exceptional student initially. He got into fights. He was resentful of authority when it seemed arbitrary, but he was also calculating. He understood that fitting into the system brought benefits. By his teenage years, he had disciplined himself. He took up judo, a sport that would become his lifelong passion. He began to excel academically, driven by a specific goal. He wanted to join the KGB. This was not a common ambition openly discussed. The KGB, the Committee for State Security, was the Soviet Union's sprawling intelligence and secret police organization. It was the heir to the NKVD, which itself was the heir to the Cheka. These were organizations synonymous with terror, with the Gulag, with political repression. Yet they were also synonymous with power, with privilege, with being on the inside of a system that ruthlessly divided insiders from outsiders. For a boy from a communal apartment, the KGB represented a path upward. It represented being one of those who controlled rather than being controlled. It represented patriotic service, defending the motherland from its enemies, foreign and domestic. At least, that is how it could be understood by a 16-year-old boy in 1968. The story goes that teenage Putin walked into the KGB's Leningrad headquarters and announced his desire to join. He was told to get a degree in law. He was told to distinguish himself. He was told to wait. So he did. This early anecdote reveals something essential about Putin's character. Once he sets a goal, he pursues it with methodical patience. He does not seek attention or glory in the pursuit. He simply does what is necessary, step by step, year by year, until the objective is achieved. In 1970, Putin enrolled in the law department at Leningrad State University. He studied. He kept his head down. He continued with judo, eventually earning a black belt and coaching younger students. He met a woman named Lyudmila, whom he would eventually marry. He maintained contact with KGB officers who monitored promising university students. And in 1975, upon graduation, his patience paid off. He was recruited into the KGB. For Putin, this must have felt like arriving. He was 23 years old. He was about to enter the inner sanctum of Soviet power. He was about to become one of the guardians of the system. But the system he was joining was already dying, though few yet realized it. The Soviet Union in 1975 had perhaps 15 years left. The KGB that Putin joined with such ambition would be dissolved before he turned 40. The certainties he had absorbed since childhood, the Soviet Union's permanence, communism's inevitability, Russia's role as superpower, would all collapse. How does a man shaped by such a system respond when that system disintegrates? That question would define the rest of Putin's life, and through him, the rest of Russia's history. But before we follow Putin into his KGB career, we need to understand the broader context of the 1970s and 80s. What was the Soviet Union actually like during these decades? What were ordinary Russians experiencing? What were the pressures building beneath the surface that would eventually tear the entire system apart? The Soviet Union of the late Brezhnev era, stretching into the early 1980s, was a strange mix of superpower status and internal decay. On paper, it was one of the two dominant powers on Earth, locked in global competition with the United States. It had the world's largest military. It had nuclear weapons capable of destroying civilization. It had satellites and client states across the globe. It launched cosmonauts into space with regularity that suggested unlimited resources and technological sophistication. But behind this facade, the economy was stagnating. The centrally planned system that had been able to mobilize resources for rapid industrialization in the 1930s and 40s was proving increasingly dysfunctional in a complex, modern economy. Innovation was stifled. Consumer goods were shoddy and scarce. Agriculture was inefficient despite the country's vast farmland. The main thing keeping the system afloat was oil revenue as global energy prices rose through the 1970s. The social contract was fraying too. The older generation still believed, or at least remembered, the hardships that made Soviet stability attractive by comparison. But younger Soviets, Putin's generation, were increasingly cynical. They went through the motions. They joined the party if it helped their careers. They mouthed the slogans. But belief was being replaced by conformity. Conformity was being replaced by indifference, and indifference was slowly giving way to resentment. Picture a typical day in the life of a Leningrad resident in, say, 1980. You wake in your communal apartment. You wait your turn for the bathroom, shared with 3 other families. You dress in clothes that are functional but unstylish, made from materials that wear out quickly. You might listen to the radio, all state-controlled, of course. The news tells you about the latest achievements of the Soviet people and the latest crimes of American imperialism. You go to your job. If you are lucky, it is meaningful work that you find satisfying. More likely, it is a position in a bloated bureaucracy where productivity matters less than following procedures and maintaining good relations with your supervisors. Your salary is modest, but predictable. You know you will never be rich, but you also know you will never starve, never be homeless, never lack access to basic healthcare or education. After work, you might stop by several stores, searching for basic goods. There is plenty of bread, but you need light bulbs, or shoes, or fresh vegetables, or toilet paper. You might find what you need. You might not. If something rare appears, good quality meat, or oranges, or imported goods, Word spreads quickly and queues form. You join them automatically, even if you do not need the item, because you might be able to trade it for something you do need. In the evening, you might watch state television. There are few channels and programming is controlled. Or you might read. Russians are voracious readers, and books at least are affordable. You might meet friends at someone's apartment, drinking tea or vodka, discussing life in carefully coded language. Everyone knows there are limits to what can be said openly. Everyone knows that walls might have ears. Not because you are necessarily under surveillance, but because someone you know might report something to protect themselves, or out of spite, or simply because they have been trained that civic duty includes reporting suspicious behavior. This is not a life of terror, not like Stalin's time, but it is a life of constraints, of monitoring yourself, of navigating between official reality and lived experience. The Soviet Union still works in its way, but it works less well with each passing year. And within this system, Vladimir Putin is learning the craft of intelligence work. Chapter 1. The Making of a KGB Officer. When Putin entered the KGB in 1975, he joined an organization that was, in many ways, a state within the state. The KGB controlled its own troops, its own prisons, its own communications networks. It penetrated every institution in Soviet society. It conducted foreign intelligence operations. It monitored dissidents. It protected the political leadership. It certified who could travel abroad. It had power over life and death, career and catastrophe. The KGB was also highly stratified. The elite served in foreign intelligence, operating abroad under diplomatic cover or as illegals with false identities. The middle tier handled counterintelligence, monitoring foreigners in the Soviet Union and Soviets who had contact with foreigners. The vast base consisted of informants, part-time operatives, and those who simply contributed bits of information in exchange for small privileges. Putin initially worked in counterintelligence in Leningrad. This was not glamorous work. It involved monitoring foreign students at the university. It involved cultivating informants. It involved endless paperwork and surveillance reports. It was important work from the KGB's perspective, but it was not the romantic spycraft of Western movies. What Putin learned during these years was the KGB's essential worldview. The Soviet Union was surrounded by enemies. The West was engaged in constant subversion, trying to undermine socialism from within. Every contact between a Soviet citizen and a foreigner was potentially dangerous. Vigilance was necessary. Trust was dangerous. Information was power. And power came from understanding people's weaknesses, what they wanted, what they feared, what they would do to avoid exposure or punishment. This was a paranoid worldview, but it was not entirely wrong. The West did conduct intelligence operations in the Soviet Union. Foreign governments did support dissident movements. And the Soviet system itself, with its corruption and privileges and gap between official ideology and reality, created countless opportunities for compromise. A KGB officer learned to see the world in terms of leverage and vulnerability. Everyone in this view has a price or a pressure point. Putin apparently applied himself to this work with discipline. He was not a brilliant analyst or a charismatic agent runner. He was methodical, careful, thorough. He followed procedures. He avoided mistakes. These qualities, while not spectacular, made him reliable. And reliability was valued. In 1985, Putin received the assignment that would shape the rest of his life. He was posted to Dresden, East Germany, as a KGB liaison officer. This was a significant promotion. Foreign postings were coveted. They came with better pay, access to better goods, exposure to life outside the Soviet Union. Dresden was not a premier posting. It was a provincial East German city, not Berlin or a Western capital. But it was abroad. He brought Lyudmila and their young daughter Maria. They lived in a modest apartment provided by the Stasi, East Germany's secret police. Their second daughter, Katerina, would be born in Dresden in 1986. For the Putin family, these were years of relative comfort compared to what they had known in Leningrad. But for Putin professionally, Dresden was formative in unexpected ways. He was there to cultivate agents, to monitor émigrés, to liaise with the Stasi. He did this work, but he was also there to witness, from a front-row seat, the collapse of the communist bloc. Dresden, in the 1980s, was a city frozen in time. World War II had destroyed much of its historic center, and the communist government had rebuilt it in utilitarian style. The city functioned as an industrial center, producing consumer goods for the Eastern Bloc. It was quiet, orderly, and deeply boring by most accounts. There was none of Berlin's tension and excitement. It was a backwater. But backwaters can be comfortable for those who prefer not to stand out. Putin, Lyudmila, and their daughters lived ordinary lives. He went to work at the KGB office. She stayed home with the children. They socialized with other Soviet families and German associates. They shopped at stores with better selection than Moscow's. They traveled occasionally around East Germany. By Soviet standards, they were living well. What was Putin doing professionally? The specific details of intelligence work are, of course, secret, but we know from later accounts that his role involved recruiting informants, particularly among West Germans who traveled to East Germany. He cultivated relationships with students, business people, anyone who might provide useful information. This work required patience, psychological insight, and careful judgment about who could be trusted and who might be a Western intelligence plant. And then, history intervened. In March 1985, just as Putin arrived in Dresden, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev believed the system could be reformed, that it could be made more efficient, more honest, more responsive. He launched policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring. He thought he could save socialism by liberalizing it. He was wrong. Instead, he inadvertently unleashed forces that would destroy the Soviet Union entirely. At first, these changes seemed remote from Dresden, but by 1989, their effects were impossible to ignore. Poland had held partially free elections, and communists lost. Hungary opened its borders with Austria. In the Soviet Union itself, there were unprecedented public discussions of past crimes, open criticism of the system, even calls for independence in the Baltic republics. And then came November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall fell, not torn down by force, but simply opened when confused border guards, receiving unclear orders amid massive demonstrations, let people through. Within hours, the wall that had divided Germany for 28 years was being dismantled by jubilant crowds. In Dresden, demonstrations grew. Citizens gathered in the streets, first in hundreds, then thousands, demanding change, demanding freedom, demanding the Stasi be held accountable. The East German government was collapsing. The Soviet Union, their protector, was not intervening. Everything was coming apart. Putin and his family watched from their apartment. He saw from his office window as crowds surrounded the Stasi headquarters. He saw the fear among his East German colleagues, who understood that when the regime fell, there would be reckonings. Files would be opened. Crimes would be exposed. Collaborators would be identified. At one point, demonstrators approached the KGB villa where Putin worked. They were angry, emboldened by the sudden revelation that the authorities they had feared were powerless. Putin, according to his own later account, confronted them. He identified himself as a Soviet officer and warned them that the building was protected by Soviet troops who would fire if necessary. This was a bluff. There were no combat troops available. Putin knew this. But the crowd, uncertain, pulled back. It was a small moment in a vast historical upheaval, but it revealed something about Putin. Even as the system he served collapsed around him, he maintained composure. He projected authority he did not have. He bluffed successfully, but he could not stop the larger collapse. East Germany was finished. The Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe was finished. And Putin knew even then that the Soviet Union itself was in grave danger. In early 1990, he and his family packed their possessions, including a washing machine he had bought in Dresden, a luxury he could not have afforded in Russia, and returned to Leningrad. He was 37 years old. He had spent 15 years in the KGB. He had built his identity around serving that organization and the system it defended. And now that system was disintegrating. What does a man do when his world falls apart? When everything he trained for, everything he believed in, or at least served, proves to have been built on sand? Some former KGB officers became criminals, using their skills and connections in Russia's chaotic new reality. Some retreated into bitterness and alcohol. Some adapted, found new careers, new identities. And some, like Vladimir Putin, began to plot their return to power. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand the 1990s and Putin's path back to influence, we first need to understand just how completely Russia fell apart after the Soviet Union collapsed. We need to understand the chaos, the humiliation, the sense of national catastrophe that scarred an entire generation of Russians, including Putin himself. Because it was from this chaos, and in response to it, that Putin would eventually build his political identity. The promise he would offer Russians was simple. Never again. Never again would Russia be weak. Never again would Russia be humiliated. Never again would Russia be pushed around by the West. That promise would resonate deeply, but only because the 1990s had cut so deeply. Chapter 2: The Wilderness Years. Vladimir Putin returned to Leningrad in early 1990 to a country that was rapidly ceasing to exist. The Soviet Union would officially dissolve on December 25, 1991, but the unraveling had already begun. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were demanding independence. The communist governments of Eastern Europe had fallen like dominoes. The economy was in free fall. Store shelves, always sparse, were now often empty. For Putin, this return meant professional uncertainty. He was still technically a KGB officer, but the organization's prestige and power were evaporating. What was a spy agency's purpose when the enemy was no longer hostile and your own country was courting the West? The KGB itself would be dissolved and reorganized within a year. Putin has said that he initially offered to resign from the KGB, but was told to remain in reserve status while he figured out his next move. This was not unusual. Many officers were being cashiered as the security services downsized. The question was, what do you do next? Putin took a position at his alma mater, Leningrad State University, ostensibly as an assistant to the rector for international affairs. This was likely a cover position, giving him institutional affiliation while he assessed his options. Some reports suggest he remained on KGB payroll, perhaps tasked with monitoring the university's foreign contacts. Others suggest he was genuinely searching for a new path, perhaps even considering leaving government service entirely for private business. What happened next was a stroke of fortune, or perhaps careful calculation. Putin reconnected with Anatoly Sobchak, who had been one of his law professors at the university. Sobchak was now a prominent democratic reformer, one of the new politicians emerging in the ferment of late Soviet politics. In May 1991, Sobchak was elected mayor of Leningrad, which would soon reclaim its original name, St. Petersburg. Sobchak offered Putin a position in the city administration as head of the External Relations Committee. This was a crucial job in the new Russia that was emerging. Cities and regions were being encouraged to develop their own international trade relationships. Putin's responsibilities included managing licenses for foreign businesses, overseeing trade, and attracting foreign investment. It was perfect positioning for someone with Putin's background and ambitions. He understood bureaucracy. He understood how power worked in Russian institutions. And he now had formal authority over something valuable in the new, nominally capitalist Russia: access to markets and licenses. The early 1990s in Russia were wild years. The Soviet planned economy was being dismantled. State assets were being privatized. A small group of well-positioned individuals were accumulating enormous wealth by acquiring these assets for a fraction of their value. The oligarchs, a term that would come to define this era, were being born. It was also a time of genuine hardship for ordinary Russians. Inflation destroyed savings. Pensions became worthless. State enterprises collapsed, leaving millions unemployed. Crime surged as both opportunity and desperation increased. Life expectancy actually declined as public health deteriorated and alcoholism surged. Picture the city that Putin was now working to administer. St. Petersburg, in 1991 and 92, was experiencing controlled chaos. The magnificent palaces and museums remained, but maintenance was declining. Services were erratic: power outages, water shutoffs. Crime was rising. The streets filled with kiosks, small improvised shops selling everything from bread to black market goods. Foreign investors were arriving, curious about opportunities in the former Soviet Union, but wary of the instability. They needed contacts, permissions, reassurance. This was Putin's role: to be the interface between foreign capital and the city administration. He was good at it. He was organized, competent, and spoke some German from his Dresden years, which helped with European business contacts. But he was also, by many accounts, extraordinarily corrupt. This needs to be stated clearly. The early 1990s in Russia were marked by massive corruption, and Putin's office was no exception. Multiple investigations and journalistic reports from this period allege that Putin and his colleagues used their positions to extract payments, skim percentages, and award licenses and contracts to friendly businesses. Some estimates suggest hundreds of millions of dollars flowed through schemes involving the city's External Relations Committee. One particularly well-documented case involved export licenses for raw materials. In the chaos of the early post-Soviet period, food shortages were severe. The city government was supposed to issue export licenses for raw materials, timber, oil, metals, and use the hard currency proceeds to import food. But the food never arrived, or arrived in quantities far smaller than the value of the exports. The materials were exported, money changed hands, but much of it disappeared. A city council investigation in 1992 concluded that Putin's committee had violated regulations. They recommended his dismissal. But Sobchak, the mayor, refused to fire him. Putin remained in his position. Why did Sobchak protect him? Perhaps because Sobchak himself was implicated in the city's corrupt dealings. Perhaps because he valued Putin's competence and loyalty. Perhaps because in the Russia of the early 1990s, this level of corruption was simply how business was done, and Putin was no worse than anyone else in similar positions. Possibly all of these things were true simultaneously. What is clear is that these years taught Putin crucial lessons. He learned how money and power intertwined in the new Russia. He learned that loyalty mattered more than legal niceties. He learned that corruption was not a bug in the new system, but a central feature. He learned that Western companies and governments would work with you despite human rights concerns or corruption allegations, as long as the money was flowing and contracts were honored. Most importantly, he learned how to navigate between different worlds. He worked for a democratic reformer, Sobchak, who was one of the heroes of Russian liberalization. Yet Putin maintained connections with the security services, the FSB, the KGB's domestic successor. He cultivated relationships with emerging businessmen. He kept his head down, avoided public attention, and gradually built a network of obligations and alliances. In 1994, Putin became first deputy mayor, effectively Sobchak's chief of staff. He was now at the center of city government. When Sobchak traveled, Putin ran things. When decisions needed to be made, Putin was consulted. He was still relatively young, 42 in 1994, but he was accumulating real administrative experience and real power. But Putin's fortunes remained tied to Sobchak's, and in 1996, Sobchak lost his re-election bid. This was a disaster for Putin. The new mayor would bring in his own team. Putin could expect to be fired, possibly investigated. His patron was gone. His position was vulnerable. At 43, his career seemed to have hit a dead end. What happened next is one of the more debated episodes in Putin's biography. When Sobchak lost the election, Putin could have immediately sought to ingratiate himself with the new administration. Many officials in his position would have. Instead, he very publicly stood by Sobchak, helping to arrange his departure from the city when legal troubles threatened. This loyalty, especially loyalty to someone who had just lost power, was noted. Putin himself was out of a job. For several months in late 1996, his future was uncertain. He had connections, but where would they lead? He considered private business. He was approached about various positions, but what he wanted was to return to Moscow, to the center of power. And in March 1997, that opportunity came. Pavel Borodin, who managed the Kremlin's property department, offered Putin a position in Moscow as deputy chief of staff to President Boris Yeltsin. It was not a major position, middle-level bureaucracy really, but it was Moscow. It was the Kremlin. It was proximity to real power. Putin accepted immediately. He moved his family to Moscow. Lyudmila and the girls found the transition difficult. They had built a life in St. Petersburg, and Moscow was larger, more impersonal, more expensive. But for Putin, this was everything. He was 44 years old. He had spent 6 years in the relative backwater of St. Petersburg. Now he was entering the corridors where Russia's future was being decided. And Russia's future, in 1997, was increasingly precarious. President Yeltsin was growing more erratic, his health deteriorating from heart disease and heavy drinking. The government lurched from crisis to crisis. The oligarchs who had acquired massive wealth during privatization were now openly manipulating politics to protect their interests. The parliament and president were in constant conflict. The state was weak, corrupt, and increasingly unpopular. Into this dysfunction stepped Vladimir Putin, methodical and ambitious, loyal and calculating, a man who understood power and had nothing to lose. He would not waste his opportunity. Chapter 3. Moscow Calling. The Moscow that Putin entered in 1997 was a city of wild contrasts. On one hand, it was rapidly becoming a capital of conspicuous consumption for the new rich. Luxury stores opened on Tverskaya Street. Expensive cars appeared, Mercedes, BMWs, even Bentleys, navigating streets still potholed from decades of neglect. Restaurants and nightclubs catered to those with money, often obscene amounts of it, often acquired through privatization schemes that regular Russians correctly understood as theft. On the other hand, pensioners sold their belongings on the street to survive. Teachers and doctors went unpaid for months. The ruble crashed periodically, wiping out savings. Crime was pervasive, not just petty theft, but organized criminal networks that operated with virtual impunity, often in cooperation with corrupt police. Yeltsin, the president who had stood on a tank to face down the 1991 coup attempt and who had presided over the Soviet Union's dissolution, was now a diminished figure. His approval ratings were in single digits. He suffered multiple heart attacks. His appearances were unpredictable, sometimes vigorous, often obviously intoxicated or unwell. He was surrounded by a shifting group of advisors and oligarchs who competed for influence, knowing that controlling access to an increasingly incapacitated president meant controlling Russia itself. This was the environment Putin entered. His initial position was in the Presidential Property Management Department, overseeing the legal affairs of properties and assets belonging to the presidency. It was bureaucratic work, but it had one crucial advantage. It meant working in the Kremlin, seeing how decisions were made, learning who mattered and who didn't. Putin kept his head down and worked. By all accounts, he was efficient, organized, and discreet. These qualities were valuable in an administration marked by leaks, corruption, and infighting. Within months, he was promoted to Deputy Chief of Staff with responsibility for relations with the regions, Russia's many republics and territories, some restive, some separatist, all demanding attention and resources from an overstretched federal government. This was when Putin began to come to the attention of Yeltsin's inner circle. One of the key figures in that circle was Boris Berezovsky, an oligarch who had made his fortune in automobiles and oil, and who had helped finance Yeltsin's 1996 re-election campaign. Berezovsky was always searching for capable administrators who could be trusted, where trust meant loyalty to Berezovsky personally as much as competence in their roles. Another key figure was Alexander Voloshin, Yeltsin's chief of staff, a quiet but influential administrator who managed the president's schedule and controlled access. Voloshin appreciated competence and discretion. Putin exhibited both. And then there was the family. Not Yeltsin's biological family, though his daughter Tatiana was part of it, but rather the tight circle around the president who were most concerned with what would happen after Yeltsin's presidency ended. Because by 1998, everyone knew it would end soon. Yeltsin's health was failing. The constitution limited him to 2 terms, and his second would expire in 2000. The question was, what came next? For the family, this question was existential. Yeltsin and his allies had acquired enormous wealth during the privatization era. Much of it was legally dubious. If a hostile president took power, someone who wanted to prosecute corruption, seize illegally acquired assets, or simply revenge himself on Yeltsin's circle, they could all end up in prison or worse. They needed a successor who would protect them. They also needed someone who could win. Russia was falling apart. The August 1998 financial crisis saw the ruble collapse, the government default on its debts, and middle-class savings evaporate overnight. Public anger was intense. The Communist Party, never fully defeated, was resurgent and calling for renationalization of industry. Regional governors were accumulating more power as the federal government weakened. The ideal successor would be loyal to Yeltsin's circle, capable of governing effectively and strong enough to reassure Russians that order could be restored. But where do you find such a person? Yeltsin's family went through several candidates. They elevated Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, but he proved too independent. They tried Sergei Kiriyenko, young and reformist, but he was ineffective. They considered other candidates. but all had liabilities. Too much their own person, too weak, too unpopular. Meanwhile, Putin continued his steady ascent. In July 1998, Yeltsin appointed him director of the FSB, the Federal Security Service, the main successor to the KGB. This was an extraordinary promotion. Putin had left active intelligence service nearly a decade earlier. He had no constituency within the FSB. He was being parachuted in to lead the organization by presidential decree. Why? Because Yeltsin and his circle wanted someone loyal in charge of the security services. The FSB had enormous power, surveillance capabilities, criminal investigation authority, counterintelligence operations. It could be used against political enemies. It also knew where the bodies were buried, often literally. Having a trusted person there was essential. Putin spent 9 months as FSB director. He reportedly worked to restore morale in an organization that had been battered by the Soviet collapse and budget cuts. He renewed contacts with former colleagues. He learned the current state of the intelligence services, and he demonstrated loyalty to Yeltsin, which was the main requirement. Then, in August 1999, Yeltsin made the move that would change everything. He appointed Putin Prime Minister of Russia. This was stunning. Putin was virtually unknown to the Russian public. He had never run for office. He had no political base. He had been a bureaucrat and intelligence officer. Yet here he was, one step below the presidency, because Russia's prime ministers often became acting presidents when the president resigned or died. The reaction was confusion and concern. Who was this Putin? What did he stand for? Why had Yeltsin chosen him? Political analysts scrambled to learn about the new prime minister. What they found was very little. A brief KGB career, work in St. Petersburg, recent government positions in Moscow, no published views on most policy issues, no political philosophy anyone could discern. But the Russian public was about to learn who Vladimir Putin was, because within weeks of his appointment, events would give him the opportunity to define himself through action. On September 4, 1999, an apartment building in Buynaksk, Dagestan was destroyed by a bomb. 64 people died. 5 days later, on September 9th, a Moscow apartment building exploded in the middle of the night. 94 people died, many children. 4 days after that, on September 13th, another Moscow apartment building was destroyed. 118 people died. Russia was in shock. Apartment buildings are not military or government targets. They are full of civilians, families, children. The bombings seemed designed purely to terrorize. Panic spread through Moscow and other cities. People were afraid to sleep in their own homes. The government blamed Chechen terrorists. Chechnya, a predominantly Muslim region in Russia's Caucasus, had fought a war for independence from 1994 to 96. The war ended in a de facto Chechen victory, with Russian forces withdrawing and Chechnya gaining significant autonomy. But the situation remained tense, and there were periodic incursions by Chechen fighters into neighboring Russian regions. Putin, as prime minister, took charge of the response, and his response was uncompromising. He vowed to pursue terrorists everywhere. In a phrase that would become infamous, he said if terrorists were found in the toilet, we will rub them out in the outhouse. On September 23, 1999, Russian forces began bombing Chechnya. By October, ground forces invaded. The Second Chechen War had begun, and Putin was its architect and champion. For most Russians, exhausted by a decade of weakness and humiliation, Putin's toughness was exactly what they wanted. Here, finally, was someone who would hit back. Someone who would defend Russian citizens. Someone who would restore order, even if the methods were brutal. Putin's approval ratings, which had been in single digits as an unknown prime minister in August, soared to over 70% by December. But there were troubling questions about the apartment bombings that have never been satisfactorily answered. On September 22nd, One day before the bombing campaign against Chechnya began, residents of an apartment building in Ryazan, a city south of Moscow, discovered suspicious bags in their basement. They called police. Bomb squad experts arrived and confirmed the bags contained explosives similar to those used in the earlier bombings. 3 men were arrested trying to flee the area. They were identified as FSB officers, members of the security service Putin had headed until just months before. The FSB claimed this had been a training exercise to test public vigilance. The men were released. The story was buried. Official investigations dismissed the incident. Independent journalists and some politicians suggested the apartment bombings might have been a false flag operation, a provocation carried out by elements of the Russian security services to justify war in Chechnya and boost Putin's popularity. The Ryazan incident seemed to support this theory. So did the convenient timing, just as Putin needed to define himself politically. But proving such allegations is nearly impossible. The official investigation concluded Chechen terrorists were responsible. Most journalists who investigated the bombings aggressively ended up dead or in exile. We may never know the full truth. What we do know is the effect. The bombings and Putin's forceful response transformed him from unknown bureaucrat to national hero in a matter of weeks. His message was simple. Russia has been weak, but I will make it strong. Russia has been humiliated, but I will restore its pride. Russia has been chaotic, but I will establish order. This message resonated powerfully with a population that had experienced nothing but decline and chaos for a decade. The specifics of policy mattered less than the promise of strength. Democracy mattered less than stability. Freedom mattered less than security. And on December 31st, 1999, Boris Yeltsin made it official. He resigned, effective immediately. Vladimir Putin became acting president of Russia. In his televised address, Yeltsin said, "I want to ask you for forgiveness, because many of our hopes have not come true, because what we thought would be easy turned out to be painfully difficult. I ask you to forgive me for not fulfilling some hopes of those people who believed that we would be able to jump from the gray, stagnating, totalitarian past into a bright, rich and civilized future in one go. I myself believed in this, but it could not be done in one go." Putin was now president, not through election, but through appointment by a resigned and discredited predecessor. But he would soon face voters. Presidential elections were scheduled for March 2000. Putin had just 3 months to consolidate his position and win democratic legitimacy. He did both with ruthless efficiency. Chapter 4: Consolidating Power. The year 2000 began with Russia under new management. Vladimir Putin was acting president, but his authority was uncertain. He had never been elected to any office. He was still largely unknown. And he faced a presidential election in just 3 months. His main competitor was Gennady Zhuganov, the Communist Party leader who had nearly beaten Yeltsin in 1996. Zhuganov represented nostalgia for Soviet stability, anger at the chaos of the Yeltsin years, and resentment of the oligarchs who had enriched themselves during privatization. He had a solid base of support, particularly among older Russians. But Putin had crucial advantages. As acting president, he controlled the levers of government. He had the support of most oligarchs, who feared a communist restoration more than they worried about Putin's authoritarian tendencies. And he had something Zhuganov lacked: momentum. The war in Chechnya continued to boost Putin's popularity. He visited troops on the front lines, or at least close to them, in a carefully choreographed show of leadership. State television, which most Russians relied on for news, portrayed the war as just and necessary, glossing over the horrific civilian casualties and the destruction of Chechen cities like Grozny. The human cost in Chechnya was staggering. Tens of thousands of civilians would die in the Second Chechen War. Hundreds of thousands became refugees. The Chechen capital, Grozny, was reduced to ruins by Russian artillery and airstrikes. Human rights organizations documented torture, extrajudicial executions, and widespread atrocities. But in Russia proper, away from the war zone, this brutality was either unknown or accepted as necessary. Putin's approval ratings remained high. In March 2000, he won the presidential election with 53% of the vote, enough to avoid a runoff. Zhuganov received 29%. Putin was now Russia's president, not through appointment, but through the ballot box.
He was 47 years old. He had been on the national stage for less than a year, and he was about to begin reshaping Russia according to his vision.
What was that vision? In his campaign and early presidency, Putin spoke about restoring state authority, strengthening the vertical of power, creating a dictatorship of law. These phrases might sound contradictory, a dictatorship of law, but they revealed his thinking. Russia needed order. Order required a strong state. A strong state required centralized power. And centralized power required weakening or eliminating challenges to presidential authority. Putin's first targets were the regional governors. During the Yeltsin years, regional leaders had accumulated significant autonomy. Some ruled their territories almost as feudal lords, negotiating directly with foreign governments, maintaining their own security forces, even refusing to remit taxes to Moscow. This fragmentation weakened federal authority. Putin created 7 federal districts, each headed by a presidential envoy with authority over regional governments. He changed the law so that the president could remove governors who violated federal law. He reformed the Federation Council, the upper house of parliament, so that governors were no longer automatic members. These changes centralized power in Moscow and in Putin's hands specifically. Next came the oligarchs. The 1990s oligarchs had enormous wealth and used it to influence politics. They owned major media outlets. They funded politicians. They operated as kingmakers. Putin made them an offer. Stay out of politics, and you can keep your wealth. Interfere in politics, and you will be destroyed. Most oligarchs accepted this bargain. Boris Berezovsky, who had initially supported Putin's rise, did not. He continued trying to influence politics through his media holdings and political connections. Putin moved against him methodically. Investigations into Berezovsky's businesses were opened. He was questioned about alleged financial crimes. In 2001, facing arrest, Berezovsky fled to London, where he would remain in exile until his death in 2013. The message to other oligarchs was clear. Political opposition means ruin. One by one, they fell in line. Vladimir Gusinsky, who owned NTV television, the last major independent news outlet, was also forced out. His network was taken over by Gazprom, the state-controlled gas company. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Russia's richest man and head of Yukos Oil Company, would learn this lesson even more harshly. But that comes later. Putin also moved to control the media more broadly. Independent newspapers were pressured, bought, or shut down. Regional television stations came under state control. The few remaining independent outlets were marginalized. By 2003, Russian media was largely state-controlled or self-censoring. This did not happen overnight. It was a gradual process, each step justified individually. A tax investigation here, a regulatory change there, a well-placed threat, an offer to buy at a good price, and always the subtext: cooperate or face consequences. Putin also addressed Parliament, the Duma. The communists and other opposition parties held significant seats, but through various means, pressure on individual deputies, creation of pro-Kremlin parties, manipulation of election laws, Putin gradually created a compliant parliament. By 2003, the pro-Kremlin United Russia Party dominated. The Duma became a rubber stamp, passing whatever legislation the Kremlin wanted. Critics pointed out that this was dismantling Russian democracy. Putin had a simple response. Russia needed managed democracy. The country was too fragmented, too chaotic for Western-style pluralism to work. What Russia needed was stability and order. Democratic forms could remain: elections, parliament, constitution. But real power needed to be centralized to prevent the chaos of the Yeltsin years from returning. And crucially, most Russians agreed. They had experienced democracy in the 1990s, and it had brought them misery: economic collapse, corruption, crime, national humiliation. If choosing order over democracy meant stronger leadership, most Russians were willing to make that trade. Putin's approval ratings remained above 70%. But Putin was not content with just consolidating political power. He needed economic growth to satisfy the population. And here, fortune favored him. Oil prices, which had been low during much of the 1990s, began to rise in the early 2000s. Russia, one of the world's largest oil and gas producers, suddenly had money flowing into state coffers. Putin used these revenues to pay down debt, build reserves, and gradually improve living standards. Pensions were paid on time. Salaries increased. The economy began to grow after years of decline. This was not primarily due to Putin's policies. It was due to global energy prices, but he received the credit. To ordinary Russians, life was improving under Putin in ways it hadn't under Yeltsin. This economic improvement bought Putin enormous political capital. When critics raised concerns about democracy or human rights, Putin's supporters could point to concrete improvements in living standards. What mattered more? Freedom of the press, or being able to feed your family? The war in Chechnya also reached a kind of resolution. By 2000, Russian forces had reasserted control over most of Chechnya. The republic was devastated, but nominally part of Russia again. Putin installed Ramzan Kadyrov's father, and later Ramzan himself, to rule Chechnya with an iron fist. Kadyrov was given extraordinary autonomy as long as he kept Chechnya nominally loyal and prevented separatist movements. The arrangement was brutal. Kadyrov's forces committed massive human rights abuses, but it ended the large-scale war. By 2004, Putin had accomplished an extraordinary consolidation of power. In just 4 years, he had centralized authority, marginalized opposition, controlled the media, brought regional governors to heel, intimidated the oligarchs, and presided over economic recovery. Russia had been transformed from a chaotic, weak, failing democracy into a stable, authoritarian state with growing revenues and a sense of national purpose. And Putin's personal popularity was sky high. In March 2004, he ran for re-election. His main opponent was not a serious challenger. The communists had nominated a relatively unknown figure. Putin won with 71% of the vote. The election was not meaningfully contested. Opposition candidates were marginalized or prevented from running. Media coverage was overwhelmingly pro-Putin. International observers noted numerous irregularities, but Putin had won, decisively. And he had 4 more years to continue his project. That project was about to take a darker turn. Chapter 5. The system takes shape. The years from 2004 to 2008 marked Putin's second term and the full flowering of the system he was building. These were boom years for Russia. Oil prices continued to rise, reaching record levels. Money poured into the country. The government ran budget surpluses. Foreign reserves grew. The middle class expanded. Consumer goods appeared in abundance. For many Russians, these years felt like Russia finally achieving what had been promised in the 1990s, but never delivered. Prosperity, stability, and international respect. Putin cultivated an image of Russia resurgent. He spoke of Russia as a great power that must be reckoned with. He resisted American influence in Russia's sphere of interest. He rebuilt the military. The dark side of this confidence was increasing repression and violence against those who challenged the system. In October 2004, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who had become Russia's wealthiest man through the oil company Yukos, was arrested and put on trial for fraud and tax evasion. The charges were technically legitimate. Khodorkovsky had indeed used questionable methods during the privatization era, but the real reason for his arrest was political. Khodorkovsky had funded opposition parties. He had spoken out about corruption. He had refused to accept Putin's rules about staying out of politics. The trial was a show trial with the outcome predetermined. Khodorkovsky was convicted and sentenced to 9 years in prison. Later, additional charges were brought, extending his sentence. He would not be released until 2013. Yukos, his company, was broken up and its assets effectively nationalized, with the main pieces going to state-controlled Rosneft. The message to Russia's business elite was unmistakable. The state, meaning Putin, controlled everything. Wealth was permitted only at the state's sufferance. Challenge that, and you lose everything. But Putin's targets were not just oligarchs. Journalists who investigated corruption or criticized the government faced harassment, prosecution, and worse. Anna Politkovskaya, a journalist who reported extensively on human rights abuses in Chechnya and criticized Putin's government, was shot to death in her Moscow apartment building in October 2006. The killers were eventually convicted, but who ordered the hit was never officially determined. Politkovskaya was one of many journalists murdered during Putin's rule, most of whose cases remain unsolved. Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer who defected and became a critic of Putin from London, was poisoned with radioactive polonium-210 in November 2006. He died slowly, his hair falling out, his organs failing. Before he died, he dictated a statement blaming Putin directly. A British inquiry later concluded that the murder was probably ordered by Putin. Russia denied involvement, but the message was clear. Even in exile, critics were not safe. These high-profile cases were accompanied by countless smaller acts of intimidation. Opposition politicians found themselves facing trumped-up charges. Civil society organizations were labeled foreign agents and subjected to regulations that made operation difficult. Protests were restricted. Demonstrators were arrested. Independent organizations were shut down on technicalities. The system Putin built during his second term can be characterized as competitive authoritarianism. Democratic forms existed: elections, parties, parliament, media, but the competition was not genuine. Opposition parties could exist, but faced enormous obstacles. Elections happened, but were manipulated through control of media, abuse of state resources, and, if necessary, fraud. Media existed, but was controlled or intimidated into self-censorship. At the center of this system was Putin himself. He cultivated a carefully managed image. He was shown engaging in macho activities, riding horses shirtless, diving in submarines, flying military aircraft, practicing judo, hunting, fishing. These were not hobbies. They were political theater, conveying an image of strength, decisiveness, and uniquely Russian masculinity. He also cultivated a direct connection with ordinary Russians through annual televised question and answer sessions. Citizens could call in with problems or complaints, and Putin would address them, sometimes ordering immediate solutions on the spot. This created an image of the benevolent Tsar who cared about his people, even if his subordinates were corrupt or incompetent. And, crucially, Putin built a political coalition that tied multiple groups to his rule. The security services, the Siloviki, men from military and intelligence backgrounds, were elevated to prominent positions. Putin was one of them, and he rewarded loyalty. Businessmen who cooperated were allowed to profit, understanding that their wealth depended on good relations with the Kremlin. Regional leaders who delivered electoral results received patronage and protection. The Orthodox Church was embraced as a pillar of Russian identity, receiving state support in exchange for political backing. This coalition was held together by a combination of material benefits and shared worldview. Putin's allies prospered financially, but they also believed, or claimed to believe, in Putin's narrative that Russia was surrounded by hostile Western powers trying to keep Russia weak, that the 1990s chaos proved democracy doesn't work for Russia, that strong, centralized leadership is necessary, that restoring Russia's great power status justified whatever methods were necessary. By 2008, Putin had been president for 8 years. The constitution limited presidents to 2 consecutive terms. He needed to leave office, at least temporarily, but he had no intention of relinquishing power. The solution was simple: select a successor who would keep the seat warm while Putin remained the real power. He chose Dmitry Medvedev, his protege, and a lawyer who had worked with Putin since the St. Petersburg days. In the 2008 election, with Putin's endorsement and full control of the political system, Medvedev won easily. Putin became prime minister, nominally a subordinate position, but in reality retaining full control. For the next 4 years, Russia would have 2 leaders, Medvedev as president and Putin as prime minister. Everyone understood who really held power. This period, from 2008 to 2012, saw some liberalization. Medvedev spoke about modernization and innovation. He was more open to dialogue with the West. He made gestures toward reform. Some political prisoners were released. There was talk of legal reform and fighting corruption. But fundamental power structures remained unchanged. When decisions needed to be made, they were made by Putin. When protests emerged, they were handled by Putin's security services, and everyone knew that in 2012, when Medvedev's term ended, Putin would return as president. Those 4 years also saw major international events that would shape Putin's worldview. The 2008 global financial crisis hit Russia hard, causing the first economic contraction of Putin's rule. This was a reminder of Russia's vulnerability to global economic forces outside its control. Also in 2008, war erupted between Russia and Georgia over the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Russian forces quickly defeated the Georgian military. Putin demonstrated that Russia would use force to maintain influence in its near abroad and to protect what it considered its sphere of interest. The West condemned the intervention, but did little beyond sanctions. Putin learned that military action could be effective if executed quickly and justified as protecting Russian speakers or interests. And in late 2010 and early 2011, the Arab Spring began. Protests in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and elsewhere toppled long-standing authoritarian regimes. Western governments supported these movements, seeing them as democratic revolutions. Putin saw them differently, as Western orchestrated regime change operations designed to install compliant governments. When Libya's Gaddafi was overthrown with NATO assistance and killed by rebels, Putin was reportedly furious. He saw this as confirmation that the West would destroy any regime it chose, regardless of sovereignty or international law, using pro-democracy rhetoric as cover. This interpretation would deeply influence his response to events in Ukraine a few years later. In September 2011, Putin announced his intention to return as president in 2012. Medvedev would step aside. The tandem would end. Putin would take back full authority, constitutionally able to serve 2 more 6-year terms, potentially remaining president until 2024. The reaction surprised Putin. Large protests erupted in Moscow and other cities. Tens of thousands took to the streets, angry at what they saw as Putin and Medvedev simply swapping positions, making a mockery of democracy. The protesters were largely middle class, young, urban, the very people who had prospered during Putin's rule. They chanted Russia without Putin and demanded real elections. Putin's response was telling. The protests were allowed to continue, but with heavy police presence. Organizers were harassed and investigated. State media portrayed protesters as Western-funded troublemakers or naive dupes. Putin personally dismissed them, using crude language to suggest they were paid agents or unpatriotic. In March 2012, Putin won the presidential election, officially with 64% of the vote, though observers noted significant evidence of fraud. But he had won. He was returning to the presidency, now constitutionally able to serve until at least 2024, when he would be 71 years old. But something had changed. The protests, though ultimately unsuccessful, revealed limits to Putin's support. The urban, educated class was less willing to simply accept his rule. Economic growth was slowing. The social contract, prosperity in exchange for political compliance, was fraying. Putin would respond to these challenges by becoming more repressive domestically and more aggressive internationally. The relatively moderate years of the 2000s were ending. A darker phase was beginning. Chapter 6: Entrenchment and Aggression. Vladimir Putin began his 3rd term as president in May 2012 with a clear message. Opposition would not be tolerated. The protests of late 2011 and early 2012 had been the largest challenge to his rule since he came to power. His response would be comprehensive repression. New laws were passed restricting protests. Fines for unauthorized demonstrations were increased 100-fold. Foreign agents laws required civil society organizations receiving foreign funding to register as foreign agents, a stigmatizing label that made their work nearly impossible. Laws against extremism were broadened to the point where almost any anti-government speech could be prosecuted. Prominent opposition figures were targeted. Alexei Navalny, an anti-corruption activist who had become a leader of the protest movement, was charged with embezzlement. Politically motivated charges designed to silence him and prevent him from running for office. He would be repeatedly arrested, tried, and imprisoned over the next years. Other opposition leaders faced similar treatment: prosecution on questionable charges, asset freezes, travel bans, constant harassment. The space for independent political activity shrank dramatically. Opposition parties found it nearly impossible to get on ballots. Independent candidates were disqualified on technicalities. The media was almost entirely under state control or too intimidated to provide opposition voices with platforms. Elections became even more obviously manipulated. At the same time, Putin promoted conservative social values and Russian nationalism as ideological justification for his rule. The Orthodox Church was elevated as a pillar of Russian identity. laws against homosexual propaganda were passed, essentially criminalizing any positive portrayal of LGBTQ people where minors might see it. Traditional family values were praised. Western liberalism was portrayed as decadent and threatening to Russian culture. This wasn't just social conservatism. It was strategic. Putin was building an ideological foundation for his system, one that contrasted Russian traditional values against Western cultural imperialism. Russia, in this narrative, was the defender of true European civilization against a West that had abandoned its Christian roots and traditional morality. This narrative resonated with significant portions of the Russian population, particularly older, more rural, and more religious Russians. But it was also increasingly disconnected from the lived experience of urban, educated Russians who had traveled abroad, used the internet, and could see the gap between propaganda and reality. Internationally, Putin became more assertive. He saw the post-Cold War order as one where Russia had been weak and the West had taken advantage. NATO had expanded to Russia's borders despite promises, disputed by the West, that it wouldn't. The US had intervened militarily in Yugoslavia, Iraq, Libya, and elsewhere without Russia's consent. Color revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan had replaced pro-Russian governments with pro-Western ones, which Putin attributed to CIA orchestration rather than genuine popular movements. Putin was determined to restore what he saw as Russia's rightful sphere of influence, and he was willing to use force to do so. The first major test came in Ukraine. In November 2013, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych, under pressure from Russia, abruptly rejected an association agreement with the European Union. This decision sparked massive protests in Kiev, the Maidan movement, named for the central square where protesters gathered. For months, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians demonstrated, demanding that Yanukovych sign the EU agreement and implement anti-corruption reforms. The government responded with violence. Protesters fought back. By February 2014, over 100 people had been killed. And on February 21st, Yanukovych fled to Russia, and a pro-Western government took power. Putin saw this as a Western-backed coup, a direct threat to Russian interests. Ukraine was historically and culturally intertwined with Russia. A Ukraine oriented toward the West, possibly joining NATO, was unacceptable from Putin's perspective. He had to act. In late February 2014, unmarked soldiers, little green men, appeared in Crimea, Ukraine's peninsula on the Black Sea. They seized government buildings, parliament, airports. These were Russian soldiers, though Russia initially denied it. Within days, Russia had effective control of Crimea. On March 16th, a referendum was held in Crimea on joining Russia. Under conditions of military occupation, with no credible international observers, the official result was 97% in favor. On March 18th, Putin announced Crimea's annexation to Russia. The West was shocked. This was the first time since World War II that a European country had annexed territory from another by force. The European Union and United States imposed sanctions on Russia. Russia was suspended from the G8. But the annexation stood. Crimea was now Russian-controlled, and nothing short of war would change that. Putin's approval ratings in Russia soared to over 80%. The annexation was wildly popular among Russians, seen as righting a historical wrong. Crimea had been transferred from Russia to Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev, but was historically Russian and majority ethnic Russian. Putin had stood up to the West. He had restored Russian greatness. But the crisis didn't end with Crimea. In eastern Ukraine, in the Donbas region, pro-Russian separatists, backed by Russian weapons, volunteers, and eventually regular military units, began fighting against the Ukrainian government. A war began that would kill over 10,000 people in the next years and create a frozen conflict on Europe's eastern edge. In July 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 people aboard. Investigations concluded it was hit by a Russian-supplied anti-aircraft missile fired from separatist-held territory. Russia denied responsibility and promoted multiple alternative theories, but evidence pointed clearly to Russian-backed forces. The Ukraine crisis marked a fundamental shift in Putin's rule and Russia's relationship with the West. The post-Cold War attempt at partnership was over. Russia was now seen in the West as a revisionist power willing to use force to overturn the international order. Western sanctions would remain in place for years. Russia was increasingly isolated. But Putin presented this isolation as a sign of strength, not weakness. Russia was finally standing up for itself after decades of humiliation. The West was hostile because Russia was no longer complying with Western dictates. Sanctions proved the West wanted to keep Russia weak. This narrative resonated with many Russians, particularly those old enough to remember Soviet power. Domestically, the nationalist fervor over Crimea allowed Putin to tighten control further. Criticism of the annexation or the war in Ukraine was effectively criminalized. Opposition voices were drowned out by patriotic fervor. Economic difficulties caused by sanctions and falling oil prices were blamed on Western hostility rather than government policy. The years from 2014 to 2018 saw Putin consolidate what was now clearly an authoritarian regime. Elections remained, but they were hollow rituals. The Duma was entirely compliant. Regional governors were appointed, not elected. The media was state-controlled. Civil society was suppressed. Political opposition was marginalized or imprisoned. And yet Putin remained personally popular, with approval ratings consistently above 60% and often much higher. How was this possible in an authoritarian system? Part of it was genuine support. Many Russians, particularly older and more rural Russians, truly believed in Putin's narrative. They remembered the chaos of the 90s. They appreciated the stability and modest prosperity of the 2000s. They agreed that Russia needed strong leadership. They supported the annexation of Crimea and resistance to Western influence. Part of it was manufactured through control of information. State television, which most Russians relied on for news, presented a relentlessly pro-Putin narrative. Opposition voices were absent or discredited. The narrative of a resurgent Russia standing up to hostile West was reinforced daily. Alternative information sources, independent media, the internet, were accessible but required active seeking out. Part of it was apathy and fear. Opposing Putin could cost you your job, freedom, or life. Why bother when the outcome of elections was predetermined? Better to focus on your personal life and stay out of politics. This depoliticization was itself a form of control. And part of it was the lack of alternatives. The opposition was fragmented, weak, and offered no clear vision of how Russia could be different. Putin controlled the system so thoroughly that imagining change was difficult. He was the default, the status quo, the devil you knew. In 2018, Putin ran for re-election, his fourth term as president. There was no real competition. The most significant potential challenger, Alexei Navalny, was barred from running due to his politically motivated criminal conviction. Putin won with 77% of the vote. He would serve until at least 2024. But by this point, the system Putin had built faced serious challenges. The economy had stagnated since 2014, with sanctions, low oil prices, and lack of diversification limiting growth. Living standards had stopped improving. The social contract, prosperity in exchange for political compliance, was breaking down. Younger Russians, who had no memory of Soviet stability or 90s chaos, were less persuaded by Putin's narrative. They wanted opportunity, not just order. They wanted honesty, not propaganda. They saw through the managed democracy, but they had no means to change it. Putin's response was to tighten control even further. Constitutional amendments in 2020 reset his term limits, allowing him to remain president until 2036, when he would be 83 years old. The message was clear. Putin was president for life, or until he chose otherwise. The pandemic in 2020 highlighted the system's weaknesses: corruption, inefficiency, prioritization of control over competence. But it also gave Putin cover to further restrict freedoms and crack down on dissent. And then in 2022, Putin made the decision that would define his legacy and perhaps ultimately end his rule: the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Chapter 7. The invasion and its consequences.
In the months leading up to February 2022, Russian forces massed on Ukraine's borders. Satellite images showed tank divisions, artillery units, combat aircraft, over 100,000 troops. Western intelligence agencies warned publicly that Russia was preparing to invade. Putin denied it, calling such claims Western hysteria and provocations. On February 21, 2022, Putin gave a long, rambling speech in which he questioned Ukraine's right to exist as an independent nation. He described Ukraine as historically Russian territory, artificially separated by Bolshevik policies. He blamed Western expansion for creating the crisis. He signaled that military action was imminent. 3 days later, on February the 24th, Russian forces invaded Ukraine from multiple directions: from Belarus in the north, from Russia in the east, from Crimea in the south. The goal, it seemed, was to quickly seize Kiev, decapitate the Ukrainian government, and install a puppet regime. Putin apparently believed that Ukraine would collapse within days, just as Crimea had fallen without real resistance in 2014. He was wrong. Ukrainians fought back fiercely. The government stayed in Kiev. Western countries provided Ukraine with weapons and intelligence. What Putin intended as a quick operation turned into a grinding war of attrition. The military campaign went badly for Russia. Poorly planned, with logistics failures, weak coordination, and apparently based on faulty intelligence, suggesting Ukrainians would not seriously resist. Russian forces took heavy casualties. The elite VDV paratroopers were decimated in failed assaults. Generals were killed in combat, suggesting command and control problems. Equipment proved less advanced than advertised. The vaunted Russian military looked unprepared and incompetent, but Russia's failures did not stop the war. Unable to win quickly, Russian forces shifted to grinding attrition, artillery bombardments, siege warfare, deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. Ukrainian cities like Mariupol were destroyed, millions of refugees fled, thousands of civilians were killed. The West responded with unprecedented sanctions. Russian banks were cut off from international financial systems. Russian oligarchs' assets were frozen. Technology exports to Russia were banned. Major Western companies pulled out of Russia. The Russian economy contracted sharply. The ruble crashed, though it later partially recovered through capital controls. Internationally, Russia became a pariah. Finland and Sweden, long neutral, applied to join NATO, exactly the opposite of what Putin supposedly intended to prevent. Russia was suspended from international organizations. Putin himself became a wanted war criminal. with the International Criminal Court issuing an arrest warrant for him over the deportation of Ukrainian children. Within Russia, Putin cracked down even harder on dissent. Calling the invasion a war rather than a special military operation became a criminal offense. Independent media outlets closed or fled abroad. Protesters were arrested immediately. Anyone opposing the war faced prosecution. Hundreds of thousands of Russians, particularly educated professionals, fled the country to avoid conscription or political repression. The war dragged on. Russia mobilized hundreds of thousands of additional troops. Ukraine, supplied with Western weapons, launched counteroffensives that recaptured significant territory. But neither side could achieve decisive victory. The war settled into bloody stalemate, with tens of thousands dead on both sides and no clear path to resolution. Putin justified the invasion in increasingly desperate terms. Ukraine was controlled by Nazis. The West was using Ukraine to destroy Russia. Russia was fighting for its survival. These claims were propaganda, disconnected from reality, but they were all Putin had to maintain domestic support for a catastrophically failed war. The invasion has been a strategic disaster for Russia. It has weakened the Russian military, isolated Russia internationally, damaged the economy, accelerated NATO expansion, unified the West against Russia, and killed tens of thousands of Russian soldiers. It has made Ukraine, which Putin wanted to bring back into Russia's orbit, permanently hostile, and it has damaged Putin's own standing, both internationally and increasingly among Russians who see through the propaganda. Yet Putin continues the war. Why? Partly because stopping would mean admitting failure, which his personalized authoritarian system cannot tolerate. Partly because he has staked everything on this gamble. Partly because he appears to genuinely believe his own propaganda about NATO expansion and Ukrainian Nazis. And partly because he has no exit strategy that preserves both Ukraine's sovereignty and his own political survival. The war has also revealed the nature of Putin's system. It is brittle and sclerotic, unable to adapt or correct errors. It is built on lies that Putin himself may have come to believe. It prioritizes loyalty over competence, propaganda over truth, control over effectiveness. These are not weaknesses unique to Putin's Russia. They are inherent tendencies in personalized authoritarian regimes. And yet, as of now, Putin remains in power. His grip on Russia seems secure despite the disaster. The security services remain loyal. The oligarchs, cowed by years of repression, stay in line. The public, fed constant propaganda, and with no viable alternative, largely supports or at least tolerates his rule. Opposition figures are in prison, in exile, or dead. In 2023, the mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin briefly challenged Putin's authority, marching his Wagner Group forces toward Moscow in what appeared to be a mutiny or coup attempt. But the challenge fizzled, and Prigozhin was killed 2 months later in a suspicious plane crash. The incident showed both that challenges to Putin could emerge and that Putin remains capable of crushing them. So Vladimir Putin endures, more than 2 decades after that snowy New Year's Eve when Boris Yeltsin resigned and made him president. The young KGB officer who returned from Dresden to an uncertain future has become an aged autocrat who has fundamentally reshaped Russia and whose decisions have reverberated across the world. How has he held power for so long? That is the question we must now try to answer. Chapter 8. The Mechanisms of Power. To understand how Putin has maintained power for more than 2 decades requires looking beyond his personal qualities to the system he built. It is a system with multiple reinforcing mechanisms of control. First, there is the security apparatus. The FSB, The direct successor to the KGB is the core of Putin's power. It conducts domestic surveillance. It investigates and prosecutes political opponents. It controls information about threats and enemies, real or fabricated. Putin staffed its leadership with loyalists, many from his St. Petersburg days or his time as FSB director. The organization has enormous power and no effective oversight. Beyond the FSB, there are multiple other security agencies. The Military Intelligence GRU, the Foreign Intelligence SVR, the Interior Ministry troops, the National Guard, all competing for resources and influence, but all ultimately loyal to Putin. This redundancy prevents any single organization from becoming too powerful while ensuring Putin always has forces to deploy against threats. Second, there is control of economic resources. The Russian state controls the commanding heights of the economy through state-owned companies like Gazprom, Rosneft, and others. These companies provide revenue that flows through the state budget, giving Putin resources to distribute as patronage. Their leadership positions are given to loyalists. Their revenues fund everything from the military to social spending to slush funds for political projects. Putin also co-opted the oligarchs. Those who accepted his rules, stay loyal, don't challenge me politically, were allowed to keep their wealth and even prosper further. Those who challenged him, Berezovsky, Khodorkovsky, Prigozhin, were destroyed. This created a class of very wealthy Russians whose fortunes depend on Putin's continued rule. They have every incentive to support him. Third, there is media control. Russian state television, which most Russians rely on for news, presents a relentlessly pro-Putin narrative. Opposition voices are absent. Western criticism is portrayed as hypocritical and motivated by hostility to Russia. Problems are blamed on saboteurs, fifth columnists, or external enemies, not on government policy. This propaganda is sophisticated, mixing genuine grievances with lies, half-truths with provable facts, making it difficult for ordinary Russians to sort truth from fiction. Independent media exists, but is marginal. Outlets like Novaya Gazeta or Meduza have small, primarily urban, educated audiences. They face constant harassment, investigations, fines, foreign agent designations, threats. Journalists know that serious investigative work risks imprisonment or death. Self-censorship is rampant even in nominally independent outlets. Fourth, there is political control. The electoral system is manipulated at every level. Opposition candidates are disqualified, their petitions rejected on technicalities. Genuine opposition parties are kept off ballots. Fake opposition parties controlled by the Kremlin provide the appearance of choice while not challenging real power. State resources are used to support United Russia, the ruling party. Election day sees ballot stuffing, carousel voting, pressure on employees to vote correctly. Yet elections still happen. This is important. Authoritarianism in modern Russia does not abolish democratic forms. It hollows them out. The forms remain, creating plausible deniability and making it harder for opponents to mobilize around clear demands. After all, there are elections. There are multiple parties. There is a parliament. How can this be a dictatorship? Fifth, there is repression. Political opposition is criminalized through vague laws against extremism, foreign agency, and discrediting the armed forces. Protesters are arrested and fined or imprisoned. Opposition leaders are on trial or in prison. Alexei Navalny, Vladimir Karamurza, Ilya Yashin, many others. Some opposition figures have been murdered. Boris Nemtsov shot near the Kremlin in 2015. Anna Politkovskaya shot in her apartment building. Alexander Litvinenko poisoned in London. This violence and repression creates fear. Most Russians are not actively repressed. They don't need to be. The examples are enough. Everyone knows the rules. Stay out of politics. Don't organize. Don't protest. Keep your head down. Focus on your personal life. And most people do exactly that. Sixth, there is nationalism and ideology. Putin has successfully constructed a narrative of Russia as a besieged civilization, defending traditional values against a hostile, decadent West. This narrative provides meaning and purpose to his rule. It is not just about Putin personally, it is about Russia's survival and dignity. This makes opposition seem not just politically unwise, but unpatriotic. The Orthodox Church reinforces this narrative. The Patriarch and most clergy support Putin, portraying him as a defender of Christian values. Religious conservatives see Putin as protecting Russia from Western secular liberalism. This gives his rule a quasi-sacred quality for some believers. Seventh, there is the absence of alternatives. Putin has so thoroughly controlled Russian politics for so long that opposition is weak and divided. Genuine liberal Democrats appeal mainly to urban, educated Russians, a minority. Communists remain, but offer nostalgia for a failed system. Nationalists exist, but Putin has co-opted their agenda. There is no clear alternative leader or program that could unite opposition and offer Russians a better vision. This is not accidental. Putin has systematically prevented the emergence of alternatives. Potential challengers are co-opted, marginalized, or destroyed before they can build support. Independent institutions that could nurture alternatives, universities, media, civil society organizations, are controlled or suppressed. Eighth, and crucially, there is a genuine social base of support. This is important to understand. Putin's rule is not maintained solely through repression. Many Russians genuinely support him. Older Russians remember Soviet stability and 90s chaos and prefer Putin's order. Rural and small-town Russians, who see fewer benefits from globalization and who are more culturally conservative, support his traditional values agenda. Those whose livelihoods depend on state employment, teachers, doctors, bureaucrats, security services, have reason to support the system. Putin's approval ratings, even accounting for manipulation and fear-driven responses, reflect real support. That support is based partly on propaganda and limited information, but it is also based on real experiences and preferences. For many Russians, Putin represents stability, order, national pride, and protection of traditional values. They are willing to accept lack of democracy and personal freedoms in exchange. This support is particularly strong among those over 45, those living outside major cities, and those whose income and status improved during the 2000s when oil revenue funded better living standards. These groups remember when things were worse and give Putin credit for improvement. Finally, there is Putin's own political skill. He is an astute reader of people and situations. He understands power, how to accumulate it, how to maintain it, how to use it. He is patient, waiting for opportunities rather than forcing them. He is ruthless when necessary, willing to use violence, repression, and manipulation. But he is also careful, rarely overreaching, always leaving himself escape routes. Putin understands that absolute control is impossible and unnecessary. He does not need to control everything, just the things that matter. Security services, energy resources, major media, election machinery, potential challengers. Everything else can have some flexibility. This targeted control is more sustainable than totalitarian control. He also understands narrative. His speeches and public appearances consistently reinforce key themes. Russia is great, the West is hostile, stability requires strong leadership, traditional values must be defended. These themes resonate with large portions of the Russian public and provide justification for authoritarian rule. And he understands that his personal survival is tied to the system's survival. If he leaves power, particularly involuntarily, he risks prosecution for corruption or worse. His family and close associates face similar risks. This means he cannot afford to loosen control, cannot afford genuine political competition, cannot afford to become weak. The system must continue, which means he must continue. This creates a trap. The more personalized his rule becomes, the harder it is to leave power safely. The more he relies on repression rather than legitimacy, the more he needs repression to stay in power. The more isolated Russia becomes internationally, the more he needs nationalist fervor to maintain domestic support. Each choice narrows future options, making the system more rigid and brittle. This brittleness is the system's fundamental weakness. It cannot adapt. It cannot acknowledge errors without undermining its own legitimacy. It cannot produce accurate information because everyone has incentive to tell leaders what they want to hear. It cannot peacefully transfer power because power is too personalized and stakes too high. All personalized authoritarian systems face these problems eventually. The question is not if Putin's system will end. All political systems eventually end. The question is when and how. Authoritarian regimes can last decades. They can also collapse suddenly when their contradictions become unsustainable, or when external shocks overwhelm their capacity to respond. The war in Ukraine may be such a shock, or it may not be. Putin has survived other challenges. The system has proven surprisingly resilient. But every year of war, every 1,000 Russian deaths, every economic hardship, every restriction on freedom chips away at the system's legitimacy and effectiveness. Eventually, something will give. But when? And what comes after? Chapter 9. Legacies and Futures. As we near the end of this long journey through Vladimir Putin's rise and rule, we must step back and assess. What has he done to Russia? What will his legacy be? And what might come after? Putin has fundamentally transformed Russia over the past 2 decades. When he came to power on December 31st, 1999, Russia was weak, chaotic, and declining. It was a failed democracy, beset by corruption, dominated by oligarchs, losing territory, and facing economic collapse. Most Russians felt their country was in free fall. Today, Russia is stable but stagnant. It is an authoritarian state, with democracy reduced to empty ritual. Political opposition is criminalized, media is controlled, civil liberties are restricted. Corruption remains endemic, perhaps worse than in the 90s, because it is now organized and systematic rather than chaotic. Economically, Russia is more secure than in the 90s, but remains overly dependent on energy exports. Attempts to diversify the economy have largely failed. Living standards improved in the 2000s, but have stagnated since 2014. Sanctions and technological isolation threaten long-term development. The Ukraine war has accelerated economic problems. Militarily, Russia has been weakened by the Ukraine war. The military that Putin claimed to have modernized has been exposed as less capable than advertised. Russia has lost significant equipment and trained personnel. Its conventional military advantage over neighbors has shrunk. The nuclear arsenal remains, but highlights Russia's dependence on weapons of last resort rather than conventional capability. Internationally, Russia is more isolated than at any time since the Soviet Union. Relations with the West are hostile. Russia has been cut off from many international organizations. Trade and investment from developed economies has largely ceased. Russia is increasingly dependent on China, a dependency that gives Beijing leverage and reduces Russian autonomy. Putin has restored a sense of national pride for many Russians. They feel their country is taken seriously again, not dismissed or humiliated as it was in the 90s. But this pride comes at enormous cost. International isolation, economic stagnation, political repression, and a catastrophic war that has killed tens of thousands and may drag on for years. What is Putin's ideology? This question has puzzled observers for years. Early in his rule, Putin seemed pragmatic, even potentially reformist in economic policy. But over time, a clearer worldview has emerged. Putin believes in a strong state as essential for Russian survival and prosperity. He sees democracy as a luxury Russia cannot afford, at least not in Western form. He views the 1990s as proof that democracy without strong state control leads to chaos. He believes Russia is a civilization unto itself, separate from and equal to the West. Russia should be recognized as a great power with its own sphere of influence. The current international order, dominated by the United States and Western institutions, is unfair to Russia and must be challenged. He believes the West is hostile to Russia and seeks to keep it weak and divided. NATO expansion, color revolutions, democracy promotion, these are all part of a strategy to undermine Russian power. Therefore, Russia must defend itself and its interests, including through force if necessary. He believes in traditional values, Orthodox Christianity, traditional family structures, Russian culture and language as essential to Russian identity. The West's embrace of secularism, LGBTQ rights, and multiculturalism threatens these values and must be resisted. This worldview has elements of truth mixed with paranoia and self-serving justification. Yes, NATO did expand eastward. But it expanded because Eastern European countries, remembering Soviet domination, wanted security guarantees. Yes, the West sometimes promotes democracy self-righteously, but many Russians genuinely wanted more freedom and less corruption. Yes, Russia has legitimate security interests, but invading neighbors violates their sovereignty and security. Putin's worldview also contains a fundamental contradiction. He claims Russia should be respected as a great power, but great powers earn respect through economic dynamism, cultural influence, and soft power, not just through military force and opposition to others. Putin's Russia has little to offer the world except energy resources and weapons. It produces few innovations. Its culture, while rich historically, is stifled by political control. Its economic model appeals to no one. What will Putin's legacy be? How will he be remembered? Within Russia, opinions will divide sharply. His supporters will remember him as the leader who restored order after the chaos of the 90s, who stood up to the West, who defended Russian interests. They will point to improved living standards in the 2000s, the annexation of Crimea, the restoration of Russian military power. His critics will remember him as an authoritarian who crushed democracy, enriched himself and his cronies through corruption, led Russia into a disastrous war, and isolated the country internationally. They will point to political repression, media control, murdered journalists and opponents, and the thousands of Russians killed in Ukraine for his imperial ambitions. Internationally, Putin will likely be remembered primarily for the Ukraine invasion, his greatest gamble and greatest failure. The war has defined his late career reputation as an aggressive authoritarian willing to wage war on neighbors. His earlier years, when he seemed to want partnership with the West and focused on domestic development, will be footnotes to this final catastrophic decision. Historians will debate how much Putin personally shaped Russia's trajectory versus how much he reflected deeper Russian political culture and historical patterns. Russia has a long tradition of authoritarian rule. The democratic experiment of the 1990s was brief and unsuccessful. Perhaps someone like Putin was inevitable given Russian history and political culture. but others will argue that nothing is inevitable. Different leaders make different choices. Putin made specific decisions to dismantle democracy, repress opposition, concentrate power, and invade Ukraine. Another leader in his position might have made different choices, might have focused on economic development, built genuine institutions, cooperated with the West, and avoided war. The most important question is, what comes after Putin? He will not remain in power forever. He is currently in his early 70s. Eventually, through death, incapacity, political defeat, or retirement, his rule will end. What happens then? The optimistic scenario is that Putin's departure, whenever it comes, allows for liberalization and reform. The system he built is so personalized that it may not survive him. New leaders might pursue different policies: genuine democracy, rule of law, market economy, reconciliation with the West. Russia might finally achieve the transformation attempted but failed in the 90s. The pessimistic scenario is that Putin is replaced by someone similar or worse. The system continues under new management. Or the system collapses into chaos, possibly violence, as different factions fight for power and resources. Russia fragments as some regions seek independence. Another strongman emerges from the chaos, repeating the cycle. The realistic scenario is probably somewhere between these extremes. Putin's system will eventually fail because all personalized authoritarian systems do. But the transition will likely be messy, uncertain, and potentially dangerous. Russia is a nuclear-armed state of 140 million people. Its trajectory matters not just for Russians, but for the entire world. What should we learn from Putin's rise and rule? Several lessons emerge. First, democracy is fragile and must be actively maintained. Russia's democratic experiment failed in part because democratic institutions were never firmly established. The rule of law remained weak. Corruption was endemic. Economic collapse discredited democracy in many Russians' eyes. When Putin offered order over freedom, many chose order. Second, personalized authoritarian rule appears strong, but is fundamentally brittle. Putin has concentrated power so thoroughly that the system cannot function without him. This creates stability in the short term, but crisis potential in the long term. When he eventually leaves power, there is no clear succession mechanism, no institutional framework for transferring authority. Third, control of information is central to modern authoritarianism. Putin's system relies heavily on controlling what Russians know and believe. State television, internet censorship, marginalization of independent media. These allow the regime to shape reality for much of the population. But information control is harder to maintain in the internet age. Over time, contradictions between propaganda and reality become apparent. Fourth, economic development matters. Putin benefited enormously from rising oil prices in the 2000s. When Russians felt their lives improving, they were willing to accept political restrictions. But when economic growth stopped, political legitimacy eroded. No authoritarian system can maintain support indefinitely without delivering material benefits. Fifth, nationalism can be a powerful political tool, but also a dangerous one. Putin has used nationalism and anti-Western sentiment to justify his rule and distract from domestic problems. But nationalist fervor can escape control and lead to decisions like the Ukraine invasion that are strategically disastrous. Sixth, international isolation has costs. Putin has made Russia increasingly isolated, economically, diplomatically, culturally. This isolation limits Russia's options, makes it dependent on unreliable partners like China, and deprives Russians of opportunities. Strong nations are integrated with the world, not isolated from it. Seventh, the human costs of authoritarian rule are immense. Thousands of Russians have been imprisoned for political reasons. Hundreds of thousands have fled into exile. Journalists and opposition figures have been murdered. And now, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers have been killed in Ukraine, along with far more Ukrainians. These are not abstractions, but real human beings whose lives have been destroyed by Putin's decisions. As we conclude this long examination of how Vladimir Putin came to power and how he has held on to it for so long, we return to that snowy New Year's Eve in 1999. Boris Yeltsin resigns. A virtually unknown former KGB officer becomes acting president. Russia stands at a crossroads, its future uncertain. The path Russia took was not inevitable. Other choices were possible. Different leaders might have made different decisions. Russia might have built genuine democracy, integrated with Europe, developed a diversified economy, become a prosperous and free society. But that is not what happened. Instead, Russia got Vladimir Putin, and Putin built a system in his image. Centralized, authoritarian, isolated, dependent on energy resources and coercive power, claiming to restore Russian greatness, but achieving mainly Russian decline. The snow still falls on Red Square, as it did that New Year's Eve. The Kremlin walls still glow with amber light. Russia endures, as it has for centuries through war and revolution, empire and collapse, tyranny and briefly glimpsed freedom. But the Russia that will exist after Putin may be very different from the Russia he has created. Change will come through succession, crisis, or revolution. It always does. For now, Vladimir Putin remains in the Kremlin, older than the vigorous figure who first took power, but still holding tight to authority. He has survived challenges, crushed opponents, waged wars, reshaped a nation. He has demonstrated that with ruthlessness, patience, and political skill, one person can indeed dominate a country for decades. But he has also demonstrated the limits of such power. He cannot make Russia rich without genuine economic reform. He cannot make Russia respected without becoming a responsible international actor. He cannot make Russia free while maintaining authoritarian control. And he cannot make Russia strong in any lasting sense by isolating it from the world and sending its young men to die in unnecessary wars. The story of how Vladimir Putin came to power and how he has held on to it for so long is a story about power itself. How it is acquired, how it is maintained, how it corrupts, and how it eventually slips away. It is a story about Russia, with all its complexity, contradictions, and tragedy. It is a story about the choices nations make and the consequences those choices bring. And it is a story not yet finished. The final chapters remain to be written by Russians about Russia's future in ways we cannot yet fully predict. The snow continues to fall. History moves forward. And somewhere in Russia, perhaps, the child who will shape Russia's post-Putin future is growing up, watching, learning, preparing for a role they don't yet know they will play. That is the nature of history. It continues. Power passes, systems rise and fall, and nations endure, seeking always their own identity, their own path, their own answers to eternal questions about freedom and order, strength and wisdom, the past's hold and the future's promise. As this long night of history watching draws to a close, let the story of Vladimir Putin's power serve as a reminder that one person can shape the fate of millions for good or ill, that the choices made by leaders echo through time, affecting lives far beyond their own, that democracy, once lost, is hard to regain, that freedom taken for granted can slip away incrementally until it is gone. But also remember that no power is eternal, that systems built on fear and coercion carry within them the seeds of their own undoing. That truth, however suppressed, has a way of eventually emerging, and that people, even those long accustomed to authoritarian rule, retain always the potential for demanding better. Russia has survived many difficult chapters in its long history. It will survive this one too. What remains uncertain is what kind of Russia will emerge, whether the future holds genuine democracy and freedom or merely another form of authoritarian rule or something else entirely that we cannot yet imagine. That is not for us to know tonight. Tonight, we have traced one man's unlikely journey from a communal apartment in Leningrad to absolute power in the Kremlin. We have seen how ambition, patience, ruthlessness, and historical circumstance combine to create a ruler who has dominated his nation for a generation. And now, as the story pauses, not ends, but pauses, we leave Vladimir Putin where we found him, in the Kremlin, holding power, uncertain of his ultimate legacy, facing a future he can control less than he imagines. The river flows on, history moves forward, power rises and falls like the sun, and Russia, eternal Russia, continues its long, complex journey through time, seeking still its place in the world and its own soul. Rest now. The story for tonight is told.